cannabis on today, Monday, September 11th, 2017. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge today. As some of you know, I lived in Manhattan before I moved to California, and I know that today weighs heavily on a lot of people. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank our first responders who are out there keeping us safe, particularly those that are in Texas in the wake of Harvey, and then also down in the southeast for Hurricane Irma. It's not on our agenda, but we are going to do the Pledge of Allegiance. And Mr. Jack Wagner, would you do us the honor of coming to the podium and leading us in the pledge?
Podium. I know. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Amen.
All right, so we're going to start with a series of presentations, and I will be handing it over to our city manager. But for my council, we'll have two opportunities to ask questions in the interest of keeping everything moving. And so that will be after the fourth presentation and after the sixth presentation. But we will begin with our city manager.
Good evening, Mayor Hunley and council and members of the community who are with us tonight, both in person and watching on TV or via the computer somewhere. I want to invite you to this, glad you're all here for this community workshop. We are going to be providing an overview on cannabis and really looking at the policy options that are in front of not only Sonoma, but cities throughout the state of California and counties. David, move to the next slide. The purpose of tonight really is to provide an overview of state regulations. I'm looking at those issues and options affecting cities. We also want to inform the council and community about the current status of regulations in the city of Sonoma. We have had moratoriums in place, and we want to tell you about those. We're going to learn a little bit of the status of what's happening in Marin, and Sonoma, and Napa. And in particular, we've got, we'll be talking about Sonoma County and Sonoma Valley specifically. We'll also hear from our police chief, Brett Sackett, about kind of law enforcement perspective and issues on cannabis. And then we have a tool to kind of provide council what we think is a way to clarify what we think the options that are facing you to talk more about. Next slide. So the way we're going to do this, and I apologize, Mayor, we did a little shift a little bit in terms of today, but once I finish the overview, we do have a number of folks, and I'm going to kind of introduce them all briefly and ask them to kind of raise their hands as we go through this. But our planning director, David Goodinson, and city attorney Jeff Walter will kick us off when we're talking about history and legal parameters and broad policy, talking about some of those issues facing us. And then we have a variety of consultants from Muni Services. Muni Services is our sales tax consultant. And we're fortunate to have Jeff Collin and Larry Burkamp with us. Jeff and Larry have a lot of expertise in the world of cannabis, and the Muni Services involved throughout the state representing cities. So these will be kind of the big picture to make sure that we all feel grounded on these issues. And we will take some questions there and after those presentations for council to ask questions of folks. And then we're going to dive into the local landscape. We will have our planning director, David Goodison, will talk about the surveys we have put together. And then Amy Lyle from Sonoma County will give us an update of what's happening in Sonoma County, since the city is only kind of 2 miles by 2 miles, what's happening right outside our boundaries. And that broader Sonoma community is important for us to understand. And again, Chief Sackett will talk, and we'll take questions then. And then we'll come back and talk about kind of some of the policy options that are facing you, take some further questions, and then we'll go to public comment. We'll then come back at the end and be looking for, we'll talk about next steps, but we'll also be asking council for initial comments and any requests for additional information. This is a workshop. We're not asking for council to give direction formally as a unit at this meeting, but if you have any initial thoughts and or questions or additional information, and staff's plan is to come back at a future meeting with some recommendations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Planning Director David Goodison. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well. Well, just to start off with a short answer to the question of how did we get here. There's been a lot that's happened with respect to the legal world of cannabis, and it began in California in 1996 when voters passed Proposition 215, which exempted patients and defined caregivers from criminal laws that prohibit the cultivation or possession of what became known as medicinal marijuana. Now, once that initiative passed, the state legislature really didn't do much of anything to help local jurisdictions with the implementation or interpretation of that initiative, and things were, so local jurisdictions were essentially left to their own devices for a period of many years up until about 2015, when the legislature finally enacted the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act. The three bills comprising that act created a comprehensive licensing system for the cultivation, manufacture, retail sale, transport, distribution, delivery, and testing of medicinal cannabis, with the requirement that licenses be approved not only at the state level but also by local governments. And then just this last year in 2016, California voters adopted Proposition 64, which was the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. This, the passage of this proposition allows adults age 21 and over to use marijuana recreationally. So that's a whole new change in the landscape. The provisions legalizing personal use and cultivation took effect immediately, but because the proposition requires a state license to engage in commercial non-medical marijuana activity, the provisions that legalize commercial non-medical marijuana uses will not become operational until the state begins issuing licenses, which is likely to occur in 2018. And now we are in, I guess, what could be called cleanup mode, at least at the state level, with the passage in 2017, I think just this June or July, of the Medical and Adult Use Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act. That legislation basically appealed the 2015 legislation in order to combine the medical and adult use cannabis systems into one licensing structure with a single regulatory framework. So that's definitely an improvement, and it established the newly created Bureau of Cannabis Control, which is the state agency that will be regulating cannabis henceforth. So looking at local regulations, what we have are a couple of things. First, back in December of 2015, the City Council adopted a resolution, Resolution 47, 2015, making the finding that medical cannabis dispensaries, the commercial cultivation of medical cannabis, and cannabis delivery services are prohibited in Sonoma because under the city's permissive zoning structure, uses that are not specifically identified in the development code are considered to be prohibited. So this is a resolution. It's not a codified ordinance, but it represents the current policy of the City Council with respect to how the development code treats cannabis activities. It should be emphasized that with the passage of Proposition 64, moving forward, local jurisdictions probably can't rely any longer on prohibitions that are based on the concept of permissive zoning, and that it's going to be necessary for this city and others to take action to actually amend the development code or amend zoning regulations to address both commercial and personal cannabis use. In addition to that resolution, the council in November of 2016, in anticipation of the passage of Prop 64, the council adopted two interim ordinances. Those are moratoriums that address the following. One places restrictions on the indoor cultivation of non-medical marijuana, and the second prohibits the outdoor cultivation of non-medical marijuana. In later that year, the council voted to extend those ordinances for 10 months and 15 days, which is the timetable under which moratorium or interim ordinances work. And unless an additional extension is granted, those interim ordinances will expire on October 27th, 2017. And this brings us to point out that there is right now a disparity in terms of how we at the local level, look at the cultivation of recreational cannabis and the personal cultivation of medicinal cannabis. Prop 64, of course, legalized indoor personal cultivation of up to 6 marijuana plants per residence, subject to reasonable restrictions that could be applied by the local governments, and that's what our interim ordinance does. It also legalized the outdoor personal cultivation of up to 6 marijuana plants per residence. But in contrast to indoor cultivation, local jurisdictions may actually ban outdoor cultivation, which is what Sonoma has done in its current interim ordinance. But there is a disconnect in that the way the city police department currently operates with respect to medicinal marijuana, it uses county guidelines as its basis for enforcement, and those guidelines allow up to 30 plants per household for qualified users, indoor or outdoor. So this is potentially a disconnect with what the council adopted in Resolution 47-2015, and it's a disparity that we now have the opportunity moving forward to correct. So we need to just get council direction in terms of what it is that you wish to allow and or prohibit, and ideally bring these into alignment between the personal medicinal and the personal recreational. So in terms of some immediate next steps, we're going to be recommending that the council extend the moratorium for personal cultivation, that we align the recreational and medicinal cultivation limits, and that we return to the city council with an ordinance that establishes permanent regulations with respect to personal cultivation. And with respect to commercial cannabis activities, we're going to be recommending a moratorium and or a prohibition banning recreational and medicinal dispensaries as the permissive zoning prohibition can't be relied upon, and as we believe that we're going to need some time to develop whatever regulations the council may choose to pursue with respect to commercial activities, whether it has to do with medicinal dispensary or recreational cannabis activities. So I'd like the city attorney to step in here because I think he's got some late breaking news in terms of how these things need to be managed.
As you'll hear from the consulting firm that's been retained to assist the council and the city in wending its way through this kind of laws that now apply to cannabis, you'll learn that it's a period of months that they recommend the council take to deliberate and consider outreach and ultimately decide what the city may permit, and if so, what kind of regulations should be adopted or prohibit. And as such, during that period of time, the council is going to be concerned and need to be concerned of what operations and activities may in fact occur without permit and potentially in violation of whatever regulatory scheme the council devises in the 6 to 7 or 8 months it may take to come up with a program that is satisfactory to the council. You'll be told later on that the regulations the state is adopting are going to be reissued probably in November. And it's recommended at a minimum that the state regulations be included in any regulatory scheme that the council may pick should it desire to allow one or more cannabis activities in the city. So November is sort of late in the year. It's wise for the city to take a look at those regulations and decide which of those it may wish to enhance or incorporate into its own program. Having said all that, the basic message is it's going to take time. And during that period of time, the city and the council need to be assured that operations will not pop up and begin operating in a vacuum where there is no regulatory scheme or no prohibition in place. And that's the major prohibition, the major motivation of the council when it adopted the moratoria in 2016. So we are going to propose that those moratoria be extended and that an additional moratorium be adopted that would cover all other types of cannabis activity besides the two that are addressed in those two moratoria. And finally, the League of California Cities and its legal staff is now recommending that cities do not rely solely on moratoria to freeze in place the the current status quo while you're trying to figure out what you want to do. They're also recommending that a zoning code amendment be approved that would ban all of the cannabis activities that you think should remain in place or prohibited pending your ultimate decision. So the staff will be proposing a zoning code amendment that would ban the activities that would be covered in the moratoria. That ban can be lifted at any time the council desires, but it will be in place again to basically freeze the status quo in place while the council decides what it ultimately wants to do.
With that, I think we're moving on to the Muni Services portion of our presentation.
Thank you, David. My name's Jeff Cullen. I'm a senior advisor with Muni Services, and to my left is Larry Bergkamp. He is a senior technical advisor with our company. Larry is a former Board of Equalization employee who held a position with the state where he administered all of the sales permits and taxation for the cannabis industry at the state level for a number of years. And so he has a long history with the industry and a depth of knowledge that's very valuable for us. Also here with us tonight is Robert Hamoud. He's the Client Service Manager for the City of Sonoma. And Robert, if you just raise your hand, he's in the back row there. My background in cannabis started with the City of Santa Rosa back in 2005 when the city first started to consider medical cannabis dispensaries. And so at the time, I was the person who signed the permits, giving those first two cannabis dispensaries their licenses. Since that time, I've retired from city management and now am working part-time as a consultant with Muni Services. And I'd just like to start by echoing David and Jeff's comments. We really commend you for taking the time to learn about the industry, listen to your community, and really carefully consider what is appropriate for the city of Sonoma. We support the continuation of the moratoria and the adoption of a ban. That will give you time to see how the state's regulations come out. We think they're going to come out around November 18th. Those should be the base of your regulations in your local community. And then you can decide if there are additional controls and protections that you want to incorporate based on what you decide is appropriate for your community. So let me start off with just an overview slide. And once again, David covered many of these things, but this just summarizes the statewide vote on Prop 64, the countywide vote, and then the voter approval levels in the city of Sonoma. And that's nothing more than just a snapshot in time about what happened on that particular issue at that particular time. David covered many of the other bullet points on this slide, so I'll go ahead and move forward. These are the state agencies that are named in the legislation that are responsible for developing the various regulations on the industry. And as you can see, there are a number of them. And with that comes some complexity at the state level, as you might imagine, and a lot of time that's being taken to formulate regulations, issue them, and what we think will be an environment where we see regular revisions to those regulations and the introduction of new legislation. We have a new bill that we're reviewing now, AB 133, that is following up the Cleanup Act, the SB 94 legislation that occurred at the adoption of the budget. ALMA, or Prop 64 as we know it, defined where consumption can take place with legalized cannabis, and that is primarily in private residences or businesses that are permitted to have smoking of marijuana on site. How much can be possessed? 28.5 grams, about an ounce of marijuana, or 8 grams of concentrated forms of cannabis or marijuana. Where can plants be grown for personal use and how much? State law defines that to be indoor growing for up to 6 plants. And those can be in a personal residence, including an auxiliary structure. What's not allowed under AMA? Well, consumption in public. So you should not see marijuana or marijuana products being consumed in public, certainly not while operating a motor vehicle, not in any public place other than a business that's been licensed for on-site consumption, and anywhere that smoking tobacco is prohibited. So if you have a local smoking ordinance, that would also apply or cover smoking of cannabis products as well.
Jeff, can I just interrupt there for a minute? As council is well aware, we just updated our smoking ordinance, and it was written to cover both cannabis, vaping, and traditional tobacco smoking. And as Jeff says, those types of smoking are prohibited in every public place.
Possession is also prohibited in the grounds of a school, a daycare center, youth center, while children are present. And growing, there's requirements that require it to be in a controlled area, hidden from public view, locked, etc. And of course, it can't be possessed by minors under the age of 21 for non-medical use, 18 years old for qualified patients. Okay, let me turn it over to Larry for a little bit on the local authority under Prop 64.
Okay, under local authority, if you can hear me. Local authority, local jurisdictions may adopt and enforce ordinances to regulate the business licenses, local zoning, and land use. Local control allows local governments to tailor their regulations to fit their community standards and enacting appropriate levels of taxes or fees to offset the costs of administration, enforcement, and compliance. This next slide sort of breaks down the various different tax structures for cannabis. Primarily, initially right now, sales and use tax will apply to retail sales of cannabis unless consumer possesses a state-issued medical ID card, then it's exempt from the state and local sales and use taxes. Beginning January 1st of 2018, there will be a retail excise tax of 15% on gross sales on retail sales, and a cultivation tax of $9.25 per flowers and $2.75 per leaves. So you can see that the combined tax starts to climb steeply as of January of 18. And the cities can also enact local taxes, excise taxes, can be applied to both medicinal or recreational cannabis. For cultivation retail, there's a similar gross retail tax that can be based on gross receipts, square footage, or quantity of product. As far as an excise tax, the city is also able to impose administration fees that basically cover the cost of administration, such as application fees, licensing fees, renewal fees, and administration type fees. As far as the state level excise taxes at 15% and then the cultivation taxes, there's a lot of information here. I'm not going to go into detail, but basically the allocation of that state taxes is broken down into reimbursing the state agencies for their administrative costs initially, and then the controller has fund disbursements for various different programs, including research, DUI enforcement, youth programs, and other types of programs. And then finally, there's allocations for youth programs and environmental type things. And then at the bottom, once the state has recouped all their costs, local jurisdictions that do authorize cannabis activities or commercial cannabis activities within their jurisdiction are allowed to apply for grants to reimburse themselves for various different programs within their jurisdiction.
This next slide is an illustration of some of the administrative components involved with local government jurisdiction over cannabis activities. And right now, the City of Sonoma is focusing on two of those circles, the education component and also the ordinance review component, which are where we really recommend that communities start. Look at what you have existing and build your knowledge and your community's knowledge of the industry, how it operates, what you have present in your community, and understanding what you may or may not want in your community. If you decide to move forward, then it's important to understand there'll be ongoing costs to administer the program. And those things are things like auditing the companies that do business in your city to make sure that they're complying with the ordinances that you have, paying their taxes and fees, looking at the resources that you're going to need as a city to implement the regulations that you have. That could be city staff, that could be a contract agency such as the Sheriff's Department, or using consultant services. And then making sure that you're monitoring the performance of the industries that you have in your community. And if you are going to permit multiple businesses or set limits on those, you're going to need to design some kind of evaluation criteria and selection process to determine who to give those permits to. And there are also some important public safety and health considerations. We've talked about consumption in public, that's prohibited, but cannabis poses some unique challenges to law enforcement. There isn't a breathalyzer test yet or a field sobriety mechanism that has a defined limit. And so law enforcement has to use other methods to determine when people are intoxicated. Driving and traffic enforcement, neighborhood impacts, particularly if outdoor cultivation is permitted. There are often light or odor impacts associated with it. What about your youth? Many communities have questions about the impact on young people in the community if cannabis is permitted. And we recommend that communities look at prevention programs and education programs for youth, and making sure that those are present and able to be funded in the community. The industry right now has great difficulty in finding banking resources. And so it is a cash-based industry, and if you interact with the industry, you need to be prepared to receive whatever fees or taxes in cash, and that sometimes provides some unique challenges, particularly for small cities. Enforcement. Just because you have legalized cannabis doesn't mean that the illegal market goes away. And so there's going to be an ongoing need for enforcement on the illegal side of things, as well as enforcement of the regulations and controls that you have in place for the legal market. And with any new industry, in particular with cultivation and manufacturing in the cannabis area, there's concerns about the use of fertilizers, chemicals, pesticides. Even with the testing regimens, there's byproducts that need to be properly disposed of. And so thinking through those things and the CEQA implications are important as well. This next slide points out the need to understand the market. Sonoma is surrounded by areas of the county and is in close proximity to other municipal jurisdictions. And so understanding the economic climate that you're in, the market, the demand for the product that you may or may not choose to license is important to know. Looking at the resource requirements for permitting, regulating, and ensuring that compliance takes place on your city staff is important. And knowing what already exists in your community and region. Undoubtedly, there is cannabis being cultivated in the community. Adjacent cities have already permitted dispensaries on a medical basis already, and are getting ready to permit cultivating both indoor and outdoor, as well as manufacturing, testing, and distribution systems. And taking a look at your land use designations. The state has some proximity limitations from schools in particular, 600 feet. And I think a little bit later in our presentations tonight, David will highlight what that looks like on a city zoning map. And the council may decide that further restrictions are appropriate. And making sure that you plot those on a map and are very intentional in how you do so is an important step in the process. Other issues to consider. Cannabis is still illegal. It's a Schedule I controlled substance on the federal level. So far, they've chosen not to invest further budget in enforcing the federal law. There's a Cole memo out there that has provided guidelines for particularly medical cannabis use. I mentioned the banking access earlier. That is because of that Schedule I status of a federal substance that the banking industry still is not able to provide those services to the industry. And there's still going to be a continued impact from the black market. We've seen some articles and studies estimate that as much as 80% of the cannabis grown in the state leaves the state for out-of-state markets. And make sure we take a look at the lessons that have been learned by other communities that are further ahead in the process. There are lots of examples of what surrounding communities have done, what's been experimented with and practiced in other states like Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. And also know what's reasonable in your own community. As city council members, you know your community very well. You have a good feel for whether cultivation is appropriate in the community, whether you have land uses designated and buildings available that might be appropriate for manufacturing, testing labs, distribution sites, retail sales, delivery. We already talked about the smoking ordinances, and of course, cannabis sales cannot take place where alcoholic beverages are sold according to state law. And making a decision of whether you want to permit medical cannabis, whether you want to permit medical and adult use cannabis, or neither. You have all of those options. And of course, you can ban all commercial cannabis activities. That is permitted within state law, with the exception of personal indoor cultivation. So let me turn it back to Larry at this point.
So we have been talking about the industry and what might be right for the city, but the other side of that is you also have to look at the city to see what resources are available within the city and what players you need to have involved in the process as you move forward. So this slide just sort of summarizes some of the different areas within the city that we recommend be involved in the cannabis review to make sure that you have all your areas covered. I won't go through them all, but I mean, basically it's important that you get everybody involved, everybody's talking to each other. We've had experiences where one area is taking the lead in it, but they don't really get along with some of the other areas, and so there's a lot of communication gaps and things that fall through the cracks and create issues as they move forward. So a cooperative group is very helpful as the city moves forward. And then we talk about the resources. So these are some of the things that have to be done by the city as far as allowing a commercial cannabis operation within the city. Make sure you have resources to address the planning and permitting, the initial ongoing inspections, building safety, fire and hazmat and public health. Jeff talked a little bit about the audits, the tax and compliance audit. It's not only just the tax or the revenue component if you decide to impose a tax, but it's also just the compliance to make sure the industry is following along with the city requirements with regard to the industry. Preventive programs for youth or others in the community, educational programs, public relations and media, making sure that everything's out there and above board. Data collection and interpretation, and evaluation of existing workload with the city staff. Doing resource studies. We've done that for other cities where we go through and identify resources and identify hours and costs and associated with the various different staff members and levels, and come up with some ideas of what that would cost the city to implement a cannabis organizations or businesses within the city. Potential costs, like I said, permit fees, renewal fees, permit, voter approved excise taxes. These are things that can offset your costs within for the commercial cannabis industry. Oh, there you go. And then again, back to the cost. So we're talking about the fees versus voter approval. Consideration levels of taxes and fees. We'll get to that a little bit later as far as the various different fee structures. As I indicated before, the fee will escalate as of January of 18, where the state adds their excise taxes on that. And as cities and counties add taxes onto that, the cumulative tax can be quite burdensome. And with the black market still fairly prevalent, you want to be able to address those black market levels. With regard to the local tax and fee structure, it basically comes down to a business license tax, allows revenues to be appropriated for any municipal purpose unless the tax has been approved as a specific tax, and that would require a 2/3 vote from the citizens. And then the business regulatory fee, we covered that a little bit as far as the fees to operate, to be assessed against the commercial operators. That allows the city to recover their regulatory costs and their administrative costs and ongoing inspections, audits, and enforcements of the industry.
So again, still focusing on the revenue side of things, vetting your local options and opinion is very important as you decide how to move forward. Knowing what kind of commercial cannabis businesses you're going to have and permit in your community, what's wanted, and also thinking about the resources and costs that we've mentioned a couple of times now. And equally important is what level of fees and taxes is appropriate for your community. And Larry's highlighted this a couple of times, but if you added up that sales tax, the state excise tax on sales, and then cultivation, you're in the 25% range. And then think about what you might add in terms of local excise taxes and permit fees to cover the cost of permitting and monitoring whatever industries you might have in the community. And then considering that the cannabis industry is not able to claim many of the federal tax exemptions that most businesses can because of the Class 1 controlled substance status of the product. It's easy for them to be in the 35% tax range or more when you add all those factors in together. So as you move forward and think about how you want to draft your language for city ordinances, have a clear direction based on those community standards. And again, we commend you for taking the time, spending the time with your community, and thinking whether you may need additional time and even perhaps a community survey. Also leveraging the state regulations that are going to be coming out in November, particularly if you're thinking about entering into the manufacturing area or the testing or cultivation. Those are going to serve as the base set of regulations for those parts of the industry. And we would recommend that you reference those in whatever ordinances and regulations that you draft. And then finally, there's that local aspect that you want to make sure is crafted in whatever you put in place. You want to make sure that they meet and exceed your city's expectations for any business in your community. They should be different, of course, because of the product that's involved, but on the other hand, they shouldn't be different. They should have many of the same appearance and community acceptance standards as any other business that you would want to welcome into your community. And make sure that you're planning for input into law enforcement, from law enforcement, parent organizations, the ethnic aspects of your community, your Chamber of Commerce and local businesses as well, because they have different views on cannabis based on their individual experiences and concerns.
And then we've talked about the tax revenue areas a little bit, so we're providing just a summary, a high-level summary of some of the revenue expectations or things that are out there. As far as this industry, because it's so new, even though, as Jeff mentioned, I've been involved in the cannabis industry at the state level since probably about 2005. At the state level, when we were imposing sales and use taxes on there and addressing, trying to get them to become compliant. There is no definitive list of industries operating in the state currently at the state level, and hasn't been for all those years. And so as far as revenue number for dispensaries out there at the state level, it's very sporadic and sometimes non-existent, because even at the local levels, the cities that do generally impose a tax, generally it's a general fund tax, and so that money goes into the general fund. It's not necessarily identified specifically, so trying to identify specific averages for dispensaries operations. Plus, if there's a small number of dispensaries in a jurisdiction, the city has prohibited from law, and the state is from identifying that revenue for that specific business activity because it's a confidential tax reporting issue. But we've been able to identify some, dispensaries, there's more and more information coming out. And right now, an average dispensary ranges in sales from $800 to $1,000 per square foot on average. And as far as other types of industries, the cultivation, manufacturing, they can range anywhere from $2 million in gross receipts to up to $15 million, depending on the size, the location, the type of products they're developing. So there's a lot of variables involved. However, we have obtained some information, and I included a few cities in there as far as what they've reported or expect to report. And a lot of this information comes from media reports or as they're getting ready to in their bond issues or their ballot issues as far as identifying potential revenues. And you can see that depending on the jurisdiction as far as the tax rate, it varies. Sacramento is like at 4%, City of Santa Cruz is 7 to 10%, and Shasta Lake is 6 to 10%. And the various different expectations on that revenue, those are, we don't know for sure if they've come in. And you can even look at like Shasta Lake, 20,000 to 200,000, depending on what their estimates are. And some of these are a couple years old. As the industry matures, there will definitely be more information available on the various different industry groups. And as the state starts collecting the tax on the excise tax and the cultivation tax, there will be more information available as it comes out. However, utilizing the information we have, we're able to do some kind of estimates. And generally, a dispensary is about the size of a small convenience store, and that can range anywhere from like 1,000 square feet up to 3,000 square feet. So basically, using that, an average of that dispensary at $900 a square foot, an average dispensary can gross anywhere from $900,000 to $2.7 million in gross receipts. And using just a 5% tax rate, that can generate anywhere from a $45,000 to $135,000 annually for the city. Just sort of gives you an idea where you might land if taxes are something that you would impose on a dispensary, just get an idea what kind of resources might come in. And then we've also, as Jeff talked about, looking at surrounding jurisdictions. So this is just a slide up here. I know Sonoma County will be reporting later, but basically this is what they're basically allowing all these different types of industries within their jurisdiction. And they currently have varying degrees of operations currently going on. And as far as their taxes, their cultivation is anywhere from $1 to $11.25 per square foot, depending on the type of cultivation. Manufacturing is at 3% per gross receipts. Dispensaries at 2% gross receipts, and then the last three are basically a zero tax rate at this point. And as far as the different tax rates, there's a number of different considerations to be done as far as how you tax the industry. Gross receipts is one of the ones that the state has used over the years, and basically it's just sort of provides an information as far as the various different types. So it's on a dollar amount per gross sales. Audits are needed to verify the cash. And as Jeff mentioned, cash is prevalent in this industry, so audit methods have to be very creative and to verify the actual sales that transpire. It's impacted by price fluctuations, so as the cannabis price goes up and down, the tax receipts will go up and down with that. It can be applied to commercial cannabis businesses. It's common for retailers and wholesalers, and provides information on the business activities as far as what their operations are like. Square footage is the other one, and it can be also applied to cannabis businesses. It's not impacted by price fluctuations, but it's a flat fee. So basically, if the price of the product's going up and their sales are increasing, your taxes are staying at that flat rate. It's less complex to administer because basically you can measure their square feet and you can basically assess that tax, and so it's very easy to administer. It does not represent the volume for the business because as the industry matures, they're getting the technology is changing, and so the production per square feet is increasing based on especially in the cultivation and manufacturing. So that changes. It is common for a cultivation manufacturer, and it's easy to estimate future revenues because basically you're just setting those. Factors that do impact tax revenue, the business operators. It's like any other business, so you have good business people and poor business people, and so that depends on how they operate. The tax rates, the change in the product price, the size, number, and type of business operations, not only here but in the surrounding areas. consumption levels within the local jurisdiction. And as we mentioned before, the black market is still going to be very prevalent for a while, and competition that's going to be surrounding and local. The next thing to consider is if you do impose or allow commercial cannabis operations and impose taxes or fees on those, the city will start receiving large amounts of cash in big pillowcases of large amounts of cash in small denominations. And so there's other areas that need to be considered just from that standpoint, the security, basically just from the city administration level, having appropriate staff coverage, limited access to the cash facilities, videotaping and camera placements, facility evaluation. We've been working in some cities where the actual counter for the city isn't where they want to have the bags of cash. You have to have a secured location, another room, may not even be at the city hall, maybe at a different location. Some are going to the police departments or the courts or something to make sure that they have the secured facilities to count that cash. Documentation, verification, and then separation of duties. Another aspect that comes up is the health and safety concerns of the employees, the city staff, where there's usually residue on the cash, may have an odor. Some staff may not want to handle that cash or be involved with that, so you have to have safety supplies, the adequate ventilation, limited to exposure to the cash, and cleaning supplies. And then on top of that, specialized equipment, not only the security, but a place to store the cash if you're not getting it to the bank every day. Cash counting machines, and then again, going back to the transportation, armored car service. And then we also recommend that even prior as one of your preliminary steps in education is you talk to your banking institution to make sure that they're going to be okay to accept cash that you're accepting from this industry.
So we've given you a lot of information tonight and a lot of slides. And I think the message that we want to leave you with is take your time. Carefully consider the options before you. Reach out to the community. Listen to what their concerns are and what is appropriate in your community. And if you do decide to move forward, build in a process that evaluates the regulations and the ordinances that you put in place, whether that's a ban for an interim period of time or a long-term ban, whether it's permitting and licensing a portion of the industry in your community or going with a more open economic development-based process. And solicit feedback from your community on how things are going. And plan to make changes in that ordinance and those regulations as you move forward. Because the industry is changing, the state law is changing, it's likely at some point the federal law will change as well. And that's going to create a very dynamic situation for cities and local governments to deal with. And finally, we're just happy to be a part of your team here in the city. These are a list of some of the individuals involved with our company in our Cannabis Support Services team. And thank you for the opportunity to share with you tonight.
So we're now at a point, Mayor Hunley and Council, if there's any specific questions that the council has for either Muni Services team or our current moratoriums for either David or Jeff, before we move to kind of the local landscape.
Do we have any? Yes.
So I have a question on, when you talked about costs fluctuating for cannabis. From what I've read recently on the weekend Wall Street Journal, the prices come way down by the pound or however it's come down. How do you anticipate it going up? In other words, when more people are going to be involved in growing, et cetera, how do you see the price going up?
Well, there's various different aspects of the industry. So yeah, there are some reduction in prices for just the general industry. But as I've been working in the industry for a number of years and even talking to some of the local dispensaries and operators, so I've asked them, I said, so what happens when the commercial industry comes in and takes over the industry? You're going to have a big glut of just the generic type product. And they say that there's still going to be boutique and like microbrew type products out there that are going to be out there. And if they're catering to those type of industry, I mean, that will definitely be a higher priced product than others, just like with craft beers. And if you're looking at Budweiser and Coors compared to some of the higher end IPAs and the specialized type operations. So there will be some fluctuation. I think it'll be up and down for a little bit, but then it'll start evening out. And then The big factor right now is the black market. So as the black market, as you move some of those individuals from the black market into the commercial operation, a legal operation, that should stabilize the price and see some of that increase.
So a follow-up question is that my understanding from listening to some elected officials in Sacramento that the overall market right now for cannabis is somewhere in the $40 billion range in California. Is that correct?
They say there are a number of estimates that you can look at, but I mean, it's probably, it's within the realm of what it could be. It looks like I've heard as high as $70 billion, but I mean, it just depends on where you're looking at. There's still a lot of product that's being cultivated in California that doesn't even get into the commercial market in California. I've read a study recently that 80% of the cannabis cultivated in California is not consumed in California. So depending on looking at the type of industry, so if you're looking at the entire industry, that number is going to be much higher. But if you're only looking at the commercial, what's consumed, that number is going to be lower. But all that's going to take time to work itself out.
And I guess just for public knowledge, I think our total legal agricultural business in the state of California is somewhere around $50 billion. Thank you.
Councilmember Cook?
Yeah, I had a question on the cash, because I've heard this a lot about the industry deals on cash, and then it pays the city. Let's just say that it pays the city in cash. There must be a disconnect there that we can actually put that cash into the bank, and is that putting the city at risk for further litigation with the federal government?
So based on the experience that we've seen, both in Colorado and in jurisdictions that have permitted medical cannabis dispensaries, they've been able to accept the cash and deposit it into their financial institution. We recommend that you do talk to your banking source to make sure that you're expecting it and to see if they anticipate any problems with it. We have not heard of problems being incurred by local governments through payment of taxes from the industry.
All right, thank you. Are you going?
What's the net tax on alcohol, all taxes included?
It's been a while since I've looked at that, but the taxes on alcohol, there's different taxes for distilled spirits and then beer and wine, and so the rates vary. If I remember right, it's the distilled spirits is probably within the 12 to 15%, I think, at the state level, but I think there's also a federal excise tax on top of that.
I mean, I think it's the most relevant comparison is of legal drugs that people can consume, what is the tax on them, and then therefore what is similar in considering a new drug that has been legalized, what would be an appropriate tax? I'd like to know the answer to that.
Okay, thank you. We can get that for you.
Any other questions at this time? Seeing none, we'll continue.
All right, we're going to come back to David for a brief update on, we'll start looking at the local landscape.
Thank you. It's good to learn by example, and so we've been surveying other communities, both in Sonoma County, in Marin County, and in Napa County. The slide that's in front of you right now focuses on cannabis regulations of Sonoma County cities. The focus on cities is because in looking at different examples, we've see that just the circumstances of a county are very different than that of a town such as Sonoma, just in terms of scale, diversity of land uses, and so forth. So the focus of this slide is on cities, and we can see what's going on in Sonoma County today, or at least in August. But that said, when we see that there aren't many communities that allow dispensaries right now, that is definitely subject to change. Some of the communities on this slide are looking at things, have prohibitions that are based on moratoriums. Others have enacted zoning regulations. But it's early days for all of us, and so we're all still kind of trying to figure out the landscape and what's going to happen next. As I mentioned, we also looked at the jurisdictions in Marin and Napa. Those results are reported to you in attachments to the staff report. It seems that they are taking, for the most part, an even more cautious approach. Right now, there's only one city in Marin County that allows for dispensaries, and currently in Napa, I don't believe that there are any jurisdictions that allow for dispensaries. But again, in many cases, these are based on moratoria as the jurisdictions involved study the different issues. So we're going to continue to study what other communities do to learn from their experiences. And with that, I think next step is going to be our county representative, Amy Lyle. So let me switch over to that presentation.
Good evening. My name is Amy Lyle, and I'm a planner with Sonoma County Permit and Resource Management Department, rebranding as Permit Sonoma. And I've been asked to come here tonight and just give you a little bit of an update on where we're at the county and just a synopsis of our ordinance process that we've had. We've pretty much decided this is our theme, is building the airplane as we're flying it. Mainly because this was really new territory for us at the county. Even though we had a dispensary ordinance since 2007, we were really hands-off on where the cannabis came from, how it was manufactured, how it got to the actual dispensary, and how it got home with folks. So we really had to take a big look at the whole business chain and start from scratch as the legal framework was changing around us. So our direction really came after the adoption of the state law, MCRSA, as it's commonly called, that really set up the structure for cannabis regulation in the state. And so our direction, the Board of Supervisors asked us to open the door as much as possible in a very short time frame. Our major goal was to get an ordinance adopted by the end of 2016, so our operators would be able to get permitted and ready for state licensing, which was to begin in 2018. So that was our big ask on that, and we ended up actually adopting the ordinances in late 2016. So we did form a cannabis ad hoc, so 2 members of our Board of Supervisors provide us with the policy direction as we proceeded. We developed a technical advisory committee basically comprising of all the county department heads, and including the sheriff's office, to really work through the issues at a staff level. And then we also had a staff working group, which was the county administrator's office, Permit Sonoma, Department of Agriculture, and county council, working through a lot of those issues. So the ordinances that we ended up adopting, first was the land use ordinance, which really allowed the cannabis businesses, but there was also a health ordinance that was developed, and our Department of Health Services really developed that in line with food safety laws, really to mimic those packaging and food safety laws that weren't able to be applied to the cannabis industry. So that health ordinance actually requires permits for our manufacturers and for dispensaries. And our Department of Health Services is working with the cities who are currently permitting dispensaries to be able to work with those cities and provide that same health permit requirement on behalf of the cities. And the third was our tax ordinance. We developed pretty late in the game after Prop 64 was already passed, and that was on a March 2017 ballot, the cannabis business tax, which did pass. So our taxes actually started July 1st, and so we're ending the first quarter pretty quickly here and going to be starting to take those payments. We're actually having a tax workshop tomorrow afternoon at our office. And so because this was a new industry to us, being regulated was new to the industry itself, we also did a fair amount of work on implementation and outreach. So we ended up doing a large amount of, I'm just going to skip over to here, large amount of workshops based on different components of the ordinance that ended up getting adopted. And we had an average of about 300 people at each of these. and really tried to cover a lot. So we learned just as much from the industry as they learned coming to these. So it was incredibly helpful. But just wanted to echo the consultants and really making sure their resources are there. Most land use ordinances, the heavy lift is on the ordinance side and not as much on the implementation. And this has really been a flip for us to really have to provide those resources on the other side. Of course, that depends on how much you plan on allowing within the city limits. So back to the ordinances, I did want to touch on what the Board of Supervisors ended up adopting for personal cultivation. Prop 64 was adopted when we were in the midst of our planning commission hearings. So we had some ideas of what was going to be passed, but we weren't entirely sure. So we really waited until that point to talk about those recommendations. So we received a lot of public input on personal cultivation. The county had previously been using a sheriff's resolution that allowed 30 plants per patient, and there was a strong ask that we be able to recognize Prop 64, but provide more of a compromise situation with residents and people who actually needed to cultivate on their own. So ultimately, what ended up happening was 100 square feet per residence. It's not per patient, but per residence. And it's for those who are patients, there's no limit on the number of plants that could be within that 100 square feet. But if people were not patients, it would be a 6-plant maximum, which was allowed under Prop 64. And because the law did allow local jurisdictions to create some reasonable regulation, our Board of Supervisors opted to basically say no outdoor in multifamily, and then R2 and R3, which is our medium and high density residential areas. And really, so we didn't ban it outdoors in those areas, but what we said is you can't do it outdoors unless you have no other option. So unless there's no way to, you can grow it outdoors if you don't have an option to grow it indoors or in an accessory structure of some kind. We do have standards that go along with this personal cultivation. Landlord approval is required. We do have requirements that the cannabis shall not be visible from any public right-of-way. And then ultimately, what came out of our commercial cannabis ordinance was pretty much the whole supply chain. And we developed this land use table, which I have copies for if you'd like one, which has all the zoning districts in the county and all of the different license types that are allowed, and gives an idea of what permits are required at what size. So this is a really quick look, one-stop snapshot of what the ordinance allowed. And beyond that, all of our permits are annual, so they do need to be renewed every year. The industry had told us that most people in Sonoma County were growing in rural residential areas. So we wanted to provide opportunities for folks who were growing in residential areas to relocate into agricultural and industrial areas. So we tried to create a more permissive process for multiple operators on the same property. So people can lease out land, or existing agriculture could diversify into cannabis. And then we also allowed priority processing for local applicants. And then we also have a transition period within our ordinance, which basically allows existing cultivators to continue until January 1st, 2018. And earlier this spring, the Board of Supervisors actually also adopted a resolution allowing penalty relief for those operators that are already operating, as long as they got an application in by August 31st of this year. So tomorrow, actually, the Board of Supervisors will entertain an extension to that penalty relief. So those folks who are already operating can continue to work through the permit process and getting ready to submit a complete application. The ordinance that we have in place is very robust. We have a variety of different standards, both for siting and for operating. We have, although the state requires a 600-foot setback from sensitive uses, the Board of Supervisors adopted a 1,000-foot setback from sensitive uses, and broadened that as well. So it includes schools, parks, but also drug treatment facilities and child care centers. It also requires a 300-foot setback from occupied residences and businesses, and then 100 feet from property lines. And among those standards, we also require a biotic study for every property, a no net increase in water use, and also for those that are growing indoor or mixed light, which is basically a greenhouse, 100% renewable power. So very, very robust standards. And so we know a lot of people are still trying to work through some of those to be able to apply. The one thing that came out is that our ordinance is medical only. It does not allow any recreational at this time. It did not allow any commercial cultivation within rural residential areas. We also, our ordinance did not allow any volatile manufacturing, so it allows non-volatile, so CO2 extraction is okay within the unincorporated county. And then we also prohibited events and tasting as part of the cultivation and dispensaries. Also wanted to give you an update on the code enforcement. Our ordinance did change a few components of our enforcement tools. We added civil penalties. We added administrative citation, and which are pretty high. As you'll see on the bottom of the screen, the table, those citations can go up to 50,000, depending on the first, second, or third offense and what the actual violation was for. And then we do have the ability to lien properties as well. So overall, our code enforcement is all complaint-based. We don't go out looking for issues. We do rely on the public to file a complaint with our code enforcement office. And our main goal is compliance. So we are working with operators to get them into compliance, to get them into, to get permits, and really just become part of the regulated market. So since our ordinance was adopted, so basically all of 2017, we've received 262 complaints that have turned into cases following investigations. 60% of those have been in the rural residential areas, and 42 have closed on their own. And a lot of those have been problematic indoor grows, indoor grow houses, things of that sort. And we've had pretty good success having everyone either working towards getting in compliance or closing on their own. And just a permitting update, we did open for permits on July 5th, and it was very slow in the beginning. And then as our penalty relief deadline came on August 31st, we received 80 applications in 2 days. So we're up to 115 applications, and that is, most of those are combinations in a wide area of mostly rural, where it's a combination of mixed light, so greenhouse, and then outdoor cultivation. And then we do have quite a few indoor operators within our existing industrial areas of the county. Among those applications, we have 3 distributors, 2 testing labs, and we also have 2 pending dispensaries. So we do have a cap of 9 dispensaries in the unincorporated county. We currently have 5 operating, and so we've had 1 pending outside of Petaluma and Pengrove area, and we just received 1 new application near the intersection of 116 and 121 in the Shelville area, and that's for a dispensary and a testing lab. And so really what's going around the city right now, we do have a few cultivation-related complaints within a 10-mile radius of the city. We have 5 cultivation applications, and then of course that 1 dispensary application that I mentioned earlier. So not a lot going on outside of the city limits at this point. We definitely get a lot of questions about dispensary locations really around the whole county, but 1 actual application at the time right now. So one thing that I found very helpful as we were going through the ordinance process is really being able to tour sites and really get a feel for what the cannabis industry looks like and you know, how they operate. So I'd really encourage staff and the council to consider taking some tours and really looking at things. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a view of what we've been seeing. A lot of these are either through, a lot of these photos are from permit application visits or through code enforcement. But this is a photo of one of our outdoor cultivation sites. Indoor. And this is outdoor with utilizing hoop houses. And then I threw these photos in here because when we were considering changes to our ordinance, we actually went to San Francisco and toured 5 or 6, I think it was 6 different dispensaries. And that was very eye-opening. The dispensaries we have in Sonoma County all feel very similar. And going to San Francisco gave us a whole different view on what does it mean to have on-site consumption? What does it, you know, mean to have a more of a retail and delivery type operation? So I'd encourage you to take a look at those things too as you move along. But thanks for allowing me to come tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Actually, I think we're going to do a few more short presentations, and then we're going to come back for questions.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the council and the public. Good news and bad news. The bad news is I don't have a fancy PowerPoint. The good news is I'm probably going to have the shortest presentation of the whole group. So thank you for allowing me to speak before you this evening. Just to kind of reiterate a couple of concerns that I might have as your public safety chief, which is something we take quite seriously here in town. I did come before the council last week and talked about some concerns I had regarding an increase in the crime rate. And so it really kind of want to start there. Probably no secret, law enforcement's been a slow adopter of all the changes in the medical marijuana and cannabis industries. A lot of that is probably understandable given what we do and the fact that what we see on a daily basis and the paradigms that we are involved in. But our biggest concerns revolve around violence, and certainly Jeff and his team laid out a lot of our concerns, but I would just kind of want to back up and talk about a few of them if we could. Most dispensaries or storefronts are cash businesses, which of course are high risks for theft and other type of robberies for criminals. I think it is well known that there is been the dispensaries in Sonoma County. There has been thefts there, and there has been 2 recent robberies at dispensaries within the last 30 days in Sonoma County that were investigated by the Sheriff's Department. I had our crime analysts pull the case numbers from existing dispensaries, and with the exception of some brand new ones, all of them have been subject of some type of criminal behavior through the course of their existence. Anything from as small as public intoxication to as high as robberies, of course. As I reported last week, there's been significant changes in the criminal justice system, and I think we're seeing some of that here locally. I think I reported that in 2015 we saw a 9% increase in our violent crime rate in the city of Sonoma and a 33% increase in our property crime rate, followed by 2016 where we saw an additional 16% increase in our violent crime rate. So those numbers are concerning to me, and so of course adding an additional cash-based business makes me even a little bit more nervous. Having said that, I think it's important to realize Sonoma is not an island unto themselves. We're subject to influences from the outside. Last month we had 2 bank robberies in Sonoma, both of them for people from out of Sonoma County who came in here to victimize us because either they thought we were an easy target or we were close proximity to where they happened to reside, which certainly is not in the idyllic Sonoma Valley. So adding yet another beacon of places where there's potentially large amounts of cash and or large amounts of cannabis is a concern on our part. The other concern that I have, of course, is DUI, has been pointed out previously. We did see an increase in our DUI rate last year. It fluctuates year from year. It is very difficult, of course, as we move forward in the amount of cannabis that's being used and marijuana, because there really isn't any good testing measures. Jeff pointed that out. I was talking with our staff today. There just simply isn't any mechanisms out there that have been tried and tested in Sonoma County that are definitive tools that we can use in terms of determining when someone's intoxicated. Sergeant Bucagnani went to the district attorney's office last week for a vertical DUI prosecution class, and in essence, the DA said the same thing. They're having a real difficult time prosecuting these cases because they're seeing an increase in them, but because there isn't any real definitive measures as far as like a blood alcohol level, it's relying a lot on officer and deputy observations, as well as fairly significant amounts of THC found in their systems. In 2016, there's a report by the AAA that says Washington found that their rate of drivers who had recently used marijuana and were involved in fatal crashes doubled in the first year following legalization. It also found that 1 in 6 drivers involved in fatal crashes had recently used marijuana. So I think that kind of supports some of our concerns. The other one we have a concern about, of course, is access by minors and use by minors. Part of our job is to be involved in schools and in youth groups and other youth-serving organizations. So we see oftentimes parents who are at a loss of what to do when their child has decided to use marijuana or alcohol or other drugs. And so one of the things I looked at in preparation of here is the most recent California Healthy Kids Survey for Sonoma Valley. And here's a couple of things that struck me as interesting from that report. First and foremost, in terms of marijuana, in the California Healthy Kids Survey, those who don't know what it is, basically it's a self-reported test that's provided at 7th, 9th, and 11th grade, and also provided in the school district, and also provided to our kids at the continuation school at Creekside. So what they discovered is 43% of our 11th graders in Sonoma Valley and 79% of the kids going to the continuation school has admitted to using marijuana at least once during their life. They also reported that within the last 30 days, 27% of our 11th graders said they had used marijuana, and 59% had used, at the continuation school, had used marijuana. And finally, which is even more shocking to me, is 21% of our 11th graders identify themselves as a heavy drug user. And whether that means marijuana or other prescription drugs or other illegal drugs, but yet the report says 21% of our 11th graders and 55% of our continuation school. And last but not least, the study that I thought was concerning to me, or at least enlightening, is that the frequency of use in the past 30 days in our 11th grade, 9% of the people, of the kids surveyed, self-reported, that 9% had used marijuana 20 times in the last 30 days. And 38% of our continuation schools had used marijuana at least 20 times in the last 30 days. So that is always going to be a challenge for our community in terms of whether it's alcohol or marijuana or other drugs, is how do you craft ordinances and laws and rules that can protect our children from the ill effects of some of these things. And then to just kind of reiterate a couple last things, as it was highlighted in the Community Services report, one of the things that does concern me quite a bit is outdoor grows. Sonoma has had indoor grows. We've investigated in the last couple years. We've had a couple outdoor grows as well. But one of the main complaints that we get regarding marijuana cultivation is the smell impact to the neighbors around the area who are growing it. And I can't reiterate how big of an impact that is. And if you are a neighbor to somebody who has a legal medical marijuana grow, either in the city or the county, and you feel that you do not have a voice, it is very frustrating to them, and it creates quite a bit of tension within the communities. And so I think it's something the council should take heed to when you start deciding how to craft these ordinances. And then last but not least, it was identified certainly in the community services, but it's been well known to us for years and years and years that the vast majority of the marijuana that is cultivated in California does not stay in California. And that is the same for people who are medical marijuana users or not, is that most of it's being shipped out of state. And so I do not believe that, at least in the short term, that we're going to see a significant change in that, and we're going to continue to have an impact of the cartels, not only in California, but also in Sonoma County, as well as large-scale trafficking out of the state. That hereby concludes my report.
So, any questions on the last three speakers?
So got your question? All right, Councilmember Edwards.
A quick one for you, Amy. So of those 262 cases, how much money did the county collect in fines? Oh, you showed that list of fines, et cetera. How much money did the county collect in fines for those violations, 262 violations?
I don't have those numbers on me at the moment, but I will say our ordinance does allow folks to continue to operate until the end of this year. So most of those situations are just being monitored through the end of this year. Those that have closed have either closed on their own or have had major health safety issues that have warranted a different direction from code enforcement than just monitoring. But I don't know at this point what the amount is.
I'd be interested to know if you can get that information to our city manager. Thank you.
Any other questions? Councilmember Cook.
I guess my question is mostly to the county. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. It's a cash business. When you look at the dispensaries and all the legislation you're passing, when you do payroll taxes, is the county looking into to make sure these are viable businesses that are protecting the employees back by taking taxes? And if so, how are they paying the taxes? Are they going to the state and dropping off cash? Or is there some banking going to be allowed at some point?
I haven't heard much about the banking situation changing unless something were to change at the federal level. But locally, we're really focused on the land use ordinance. So we are going to be relying on the state to look at most of those issues, including track and trace and a lot of the tax payment issues beyond what we require under our business tax. I will say we've seen most of our permit applications have come in to pay and paid with cash. So it's been a challenge for our department to change our existing policies and security measures to be able to accept additional cash. And our tax collector's office is also doing the same to be able to accept cash payments. And they'll be doing that on an appointment basis. So I think it's just as much of a problem for the industry as it is for government. Everyone's trying to grapple with that issue.
But I assume there will be a partnership between the state and the county if a business isn't paying their fair share of the payroll taxes?
Yeah, most likely that'll be handled through our tax collector's office and not through our office on the land use side. So I don't know if I can answer that enough for you tonight.
Thank you.
Any other council questions at this time? So I believe we have one more.
One more. We're just going to briefly kind of talk through some of the policy options for council to consider, and then we will, any further questions you have, and then go out to public comment. So probably no more than about 10 more minutes max.
Got it. All right. Well, first, just to set the table in terms of the options that are available to the city, the state has defined 19 license types for commercial cannabis activities that are listed in this chart, which is probably difficult for the audience to read, but suffice it to say there are 13 cultivation license types, 2 manufacturing license types, 1 testing, 1 retail license type for either dispensary or recreational, similarly 1 distributor license type for either dispensary or recreational. So that distinction is made at the local level, really not the state level, and a license type for micro businesses, which includes or encompasses cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution of non-medical cannabis only. So to hone in on options that might be suitable for Sonoma, in staff's view, very few of these license types are really applicable. With respect to cultivation, cannabis grows need to occur either in greenhouses or on land that can be fully secured. And while Sonoma does have some parcels that are zoned for agriculture, they don't really lend themselves to either option. Sonoma does not have any light industrial or any industrial land use classifications, either of which would normally be appropriate for uses such as testing or manufacturing. So we've already heard from, in some of the different reports that have been made already from Muni Services, from the county, and from our police chief, about the options, that about the issues that the council needs to consider as it looks at what kinds of activities it may wish to authorize or prohibit. And so I'm not going to belabor those now, but I would like to just highlight one or two. First, in terms of focus, clearly, if the council is most interested in addressing the needs of medicinal cannabis users, that sharpens the focus right there. It takes, a number of other options off the table. So we wanted to highlight that point. We also want to point out that there is likely to be access to there is likely to be access to medicinal cannabis from outside of Sonoma, whether it's a dispensary that opens in the future in Sonoma Valley or in other county communities. Limiting youth access in buffer zones. This slide shows what the state mandates. It mandates a 600-foot buffer zone around schools. It's defined in these different legislative actions and initiatives. So that's, again, the minimum. Other communities that allow dispensaries, and we're talking about, when we're talking about buffer zones, we're talking about distance from sensitive uses. Other communities that allow for dispensaries often have additional buffer zones that apply to youth-oriented facilities, parks, or whatever issues of special concern might be associated with that particular community. But it is a balancing act, because if there is interested in allowing a dispensary option in Sonoma, as soon as you start applying buffer zones to parks and youth serving facilities, you can quickly run out of commercial land options that would be available for dispensary use. So we wanted to highlight that. So based on all of these different considerations, we've prepared a matrix showing, I guess we're calling them example options that we feel might be suitable for the circumstances within Sonoma. One of those is complete prohibition. Under this option, all commercial cannabis activities would be prohibited within city limits, including deliveries from outside retailers. A second option would be to allow medicinal delivery from outside dispensaries. For example, I believe that is the practice right now in San Rafael. They don't have a storefront, excuse me, I've gotten ahead of myself, that's option 3. So this would be an allowance for deliveries from outside communities. A third option would be to allow a dispensary-only facility within city limits, and that actually was the San Rafael practice, I believe. A fourth would be to allow a local medicinal dispensary allowed with storefront and possibly delivery. So under that option, a medicinal dispensary or dispensaries with storefront would be allowed within city limits, potentially subject to limitations on number and size, as well as other operating restrictions. And in this slide, excuse me, we've tried to identify a couple of the different options that the council would need to consider under that scenario. For example, would there be a limitation on number? Some communities have limits on size, such as 1,000 square feet. You need to provide direction on what zoning designation would be appropriate, and we've already mentioned buffering requirements. And the fifth option that we've identified would be to allow both a medicinal dispensary and recreational retail. And so that has similar kinds of issues or option considerations that the council would need to provide the city with direction on. So obviously, there are many more possibilities than what's presented in this slide, but we did want to try to provide a starting point of discussion based on factors that we felt were appropriate given just the size and circumstances of Sonoma. Moving forward, I think this might be the city manager's slide.
So, you know, as we've talked about before, we do have these current moratorium that will need to be brought back to council before October 27th. And the purpose of tonight was really to provide a grounding of information, maybe some places more detail than folks may have wanted, but it's complicated and it's evolved, and we really wanted to make sure council and community felt like on firm ground in terms of some of the information and background. So what we're looking for, what we would be doing, hear from the community, hear from council about some initial thoughts, and then we would be coming back to you once we get the moratorium done and completed, and really asking you, what are you interested in, somewhat looking at that policy example that David just talked about. And if council wants to do additional workshop, as you heard from the county, like they said that they were interested in doing medicinal dispensaries, and so therefore they've done a focused workshop to learn more about that. That only makes sense to do if that's something you want to explore. So that is why we want to try to get understanding when we come back, probably in about 45 days, to get a sense of what council as a body, what you are interested in exploring, and then what additional information do you need. A number of cities we spoke to are doing community surveys. It's a way to really kind of flesh out this issue a little more and really understand what, to folks who might not have time to come to a meeting, what are their thoughts and feelings about a survey. We hope to have a new website rolled out within the next 30 days, so we'll have some new ability, we think, to communicate with the public, which will be helpful. So that's something else if council's interested that could be worked on. So again, the actual timeline and next steps really depend on what policy options council's interested in, and we'll come back and talk about that more. But with that, this really is the end of kind of our presentation for both council and community tonight. Happy to take any further questions from council and then hear from the public.
Thank you all for all of that information. Do we have any additional council questions at this time? All right, seeing none. If you, going out to the public next, if you intend to speak during our public comment portion, could you give me a show of your hands? All right. But first, we are going to take a very exact 3-minute break. us back. So at this time, I'm going to bring it out for public comment. We're going to have a strict 3-minute limitation to your comments. At 2 minutes and 50 seconds, I will give you a polite reminder, and then at 3 minutes, please yield the microphone to the next person so that we can get to everybody today. Start with Mr. Brown.
Thank you, ma'am. Ken Brown, 1396 Lubeck Street in Sonoma. A lot of statistics and a lot of talking, but there are patients in Sonoma who are terminal and need service now. Not 6 months from now, not when you get it all nailed down. So please keep those patients forefront in your mind.
Bill Borum, 320 Davila Court here in Sonoma. Though not here representing any specific organization, I have had 10 years of healthcare and hospital governance experience. My other disclaimer is that I am not now, nor have I ever been, a recreational or a medicinal user of cannabis, and do not have any commercial interest in it. I am addressing you from the standpoint of public health policy. For the council's consideration, I think it would be informative for Cannabis Support Services to survey 2 dimensions apparently not mentioned in the presentation. One is the extent of current usage, recreational and medical users within our city. Second, the number of people growing cannabis indoor and outdoor within the city for personal use or small sales should be surveyed and determined. And for a model of other municipal policy ordinances, you should look to nearby Santa Rosa, which was not mentioned in the consultant's presentation. Council members, as community leaders, you are the deciders of policy and the direction givers of ordinances, not the staff or consultants. Be bold, be innovative. Don't allow the development of this new industry to be suffocated by regulations. Don't tax it to support enforcement overreach. Don't keep the black market alive. I gave the same advice when I spoke before the California Bureau of Cannabis Control at its hearing on June 1st. There are people in our city suffering from chronic and terminal conditions which can benefit from the curative and palliative attributes of medical cannabis. These conditions span from childhood epilepsy to ailments of seniors, including pain management. Increasing the medical benefits of cannabis and its derivatives are being attested by authoritative organizations. What our city populations need is convenient access to medical cannabis, both from a dispensary as well as by delivery. I fully support the establishment in the city of Sonoma of a medical cannabis dispensary with delivery capabilities. Please move ahead expeditiously on this. The Medical Board of California is moving ahead with guidelines for physicians. And as stated in the draft, cannabis is, quote, a permissible treatment modality in California. I spoke before the Medical Board's Cannabis Task Force in Sacramento on August the 30th, making suggestions for guidelines. The board will be ready by the January 1 deadline with its physicians' guidelines. I hope that the city of Sonoma will have approved a dispensary before that date, so that such a facility can be open
Thank you.
to
Let's
meet
please
the
move on
need.
to the next person. Thank you
Okay.
very much. Everyone gets to talk today, so please limit it to 3 minutes.
I'll move quickly. Good evening, Mayor Hunley, council members, and thank you staff very much for your presentation and your hard work on this issue. My name is Erin Carlstrom, former Santa Rosa City Council member and senior counsel with Dickinson, Peatman, and Fogarty. I want to offer you 2 broader concepts and a couple of bullet points responses from the various presentations you had. With respect to staff's recommendation that you extend the moratoria and consider an outright ban for the interim period, I certainly understand some of the policy issues behind that, but I would encourage you to also add in a time certain for the re-exploration of the ban or for the expiration of that ban, so that your businesses and your patients can have some predictability here. This is also important for businesses that are looking to participate in state licensure, which will come available starting January 1st. Anyone that can prove that they have the support of their locality gets some priority processing there, so there's a business reason for that as well. You heard earlier that Santa Rosa obviously is taking a very progressive position on this. Sonoma is quite different from Santa Rosa, but you're also not Marin either. So I would encourage you to take a look at the mistakes that Marin County has made. When you squeeze too hard, the balloon pops out elsewhere. So open the door maybe a little bit here in Sonoma County. Certainly patient access is very impacted by a lack of retail opportunities here on the eastern side of the county. I want to also highlight for you Napa's experience, where there's nothing as of yet, but they are moving forward. They are very likely to accommodate at least some level of retail, manufacturing, distribution, and delivery jobs for the jobs creation and tax base that offers. To the issue of fees and taxes, please do not gloss over the fact that they are extremely exorbitant already. The harder you make it, the more expensive that it is to get into this industry, the more likely people are to remain in the black market or to lose their homes. I want to encourage you, as we're going to look to the League of California Cities for guidance, let's encourage our lobbyists to talk to our legislators about sending more of those tax dollars back home to the localities where the impacts are being felt, rather than having each locality have to implement its own taxes. Please consider from a policy perspective that a lot of these industry operations have a much lower impact on the community. You can have delivery services, manufacturing jobs, distribution, transportation. These are all jobs that are simply tax revenue creator and have little to no impact on the community. From the perspective of young people, please look at the new data out of the Washington legislature showing no increase in youth consumption following that state's legalization. And when we talk about buffers between sensitive uses, let's think about what the policy purpose is behind them. I'm the mother of a 3-year-old, he'll soon be 4. And I can tell you that if my son somehow stumbles into a medical cannabis dispensary, a great many things have gone wrong, nothing to do with the dispensary itself. So please consider moving forward expeditiously, especially looking at dispensaries with delivery services. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Chris Petlock, 426 Napa Road, Sonoma. I just want to start with, let's not be naive. My wife's grandfather was the chief of police here in the 70s for about 4 or 5 years after coming from Angel Camp. And he told me many times that it was easier for the kids then to get marijuana than it was for alcohol. As a young teenager myself and my wife, it was easier to get marijuana than alcohol. And so on. So it's in the community. It's always been here, and I'm sure if I turned to my teenager today, it would be a very uncomfortable conversation, but we could probably come to the same sorts of conclusions. So really what we're talking here about is compassion for those that are sick and cannot provide for themselves. Those are the people that this is about, because it's everywhere else. Everybody can get it. Let's not be naive. It's really about those that are sick, those that need it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Council. I'm Cecilia Ponison. I live here in Sonoma. And I recently sent an article from the financial channel CNBC to each of the council members and the city manager. The article reports that the marijuana entrepreneurs...
Could we get your address, please?
Yes, 175 France in Sonoma. Thank you. The article reports that marijuana entrepreneurs and venture capitalists are already meeting with Sonoma wineries. And one that was mentioned in the article was a 5th-generation winemaker. They're valuing an acre under grape cultivation to be worth $200,000. The same acre under marijuana cultivation is now worth $1 million. They envision Sonoma as becoming a wine and weed destination. These marijuana entrepreneurs will either directly or indirectly put pressure on this council to allow cannabis in existing wine tasting rooms in Sonoma. Please do not be dazzled by the amounts of money they will promote and promise in coming to Sonoma. The very thought of wine and weed surrounding the plaza is a terrible one. If in the future this council allows a medical marijuana dispensary in Sonoma, I truly hope that you do, and that it be done through a trusted and professional medical administrator, and that would be the Sonoma Valley Hospital. This would benefit Sonoma and provide a needed income to the resource we truly need, our local, highly rated hospital. Thank you.
Thank you. And whoever is waiting, we can have one person waiting by the door. No, you're next, Richard. You're next. Come back up here. And then so whoever's next, and then we'll just have a little line
I'm
going.
still doing re-entry, Your Honor. I think you can understand
me
that.
too.
Hi, yeah. Okay, welcome back from the playa. Welcome home. Richard Silver, 95 Bernhardt Avenue, Sonoma, Fetters, Hot Springs. I'll be brief. I hope in your deliberations that you will approach this looking for fact and not from a position of fear. When it comes to policing, I hope that you will seek out the counsel of every city that has a dispensary, ask their police chiefs and their enforcement officers, has there been an increase or a decrease, and ask for the data. Alcohol is rampant, whether it's wine, whiskey, in this town and surrounds the countryside. Ask all of people that you are seeking counsel from the impact of having that much visible influence in the growing from the ground, in the liquor stores, in the Safeways, everywhere you can buy liquor in this town, whether it's a tasting room or not, is a place that says to our citizenry, whether they're youth or elderly, this is okay. Alcohol is great. Use it, abuse it, or don't. For those of us of a certain age where we want alternative medicines to Big Pharma, I hope you will consider that. You and your parents and yourselves at one point will need it. But look to the facts of other communities that are similar or not and what the impact has been. They did mention agriculture. I would posit to say that the amount of spraying on the vineyards and what goes into the soil in this community and in this county far exceeds what may occur on medical marijuana or cannabis growing. If that is a concern to you, as well it should be, then ask people to come forward and say, is there any spraying going on? There is the flyover effect. So look to what the community is now with the vision to what you want it to be for all of us. Our needs now, our needs in the future. But when you do seek counsel from knowledgeable and experienced consultants, law enforcement officers, be sure that you get from them the facts, the truth, the data, and do not make your deliberations or your decisions based on fear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Leslie Nicholson. I reside at 18552 Happy Lane, and I'm here representing Risk Sonoma. Risk Sonoma is a parent support network. It stands for Resources, Information, Support, and Knowledge. As a parent, we have concerns about the current use of marijuana amongst our teens and how this is going to make that even easier for them. As 18-year-olds, they will be able to get a medical marijuana card and, of course, pass it on to their friends. I'm a compassionate person. I understand medical. I understand all that. But we are concerned about our kids. And so as part of this, we are having a movie night, November 12th. The Other Side of Cannabis talks about the facts, talks about the impact on our teens, and also school administrators in the community are concerned about the edibles. The edibles look a lot like the real thing, gummy bears, things like that. They're all very concerned. So we want to have a public discussion after the documentary. It's an award-winning documentary. You can look it up online. We do want to have a public discussion. All sides are invited. But as parents, we are concerned about this and about the impact on our kids and what we can do to protect them. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you tell us what time and where the movie will be?
November 12th at 2 o'clock at Sebastiani Theater.
Cool. Thank you.
Mhm.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, staff. James Hinton, 3574 Hunter Circle, Napa, California. 3 years ago, I won the primary here for U.S. House of Representatives. My major goal was to remove cannabis from the Controlled Substance Act. It has helped me battle the horrible side effects of psoriatic arthritis, and I am now been in the industry since the election, and I've seen some of you recently at the League of Cities tour at HTP in Vallejo, which is an acronym for Healing Through Plants. Some of you missed the tour. If any of you would like to come back and visit, we would be more than happy to host you, give you a tour, let you see the products, and if there's anything else that you'd like to see a tour of, another dispensary or anything else, I would be more than happy to help you. I'm just really happy you're going to make, hopefully, some kind of decision to bring back an ordinance. I can't tell you when I lived in Napa how many times I drove around Sonoma to get over to Santa Rosa to buy medical marijuana from a dispensary because I wanted to shop where everything was labeled, where I knew what I was getting and could really get the information I needed to fight my autoimmune disease. It was much better than just scoring something, better than scoring something in Napa. It was nice to go someplace where you were accepted and, like I said, they had all the information, and it was, so the whole compassion side, like you've heard from some of your other speakers, it's a real thing, and not everybody can grow it, and it's great when you have a place that's local. I mean, I had nights where I would leave, drive an hour to get to Santa Rosa, and then the place would be closed because if you didn't get there 15 minutes early, you couldn't get in. So it really is a hassle, the traffic and the trouble, and so I really hope you'll bring safe access here to Sonoma. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, council members, mayor, staff, and consultants. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to say thank you very much for the work.
Can I get your name and your address, please?
My name is Carlos Campos. I actually live in Kenwood, 133 Laurel Avenue. But we do all of our shopping when it comes to groceries and things like that here in Sonoma City. We like the small town feel here as opposed to going into the bigger cities for that sort of stuff. But the reason I'm saying all this is because not only do I want to thank you guys in particular, but I do want to thank our law enforcement people. And the reason I say that is because they do have a tough job. They are now being charged with not only protecting the general public, but they are being charged with protecting the patients who are going to be using these medicines. We are asking that everyone in this room, especially the council members, the staff, the law enforcement, everybody step up and be a better person for everything that they are doing. That being said, I have to wonder, when he first started speaking, the sheriff started speaking about what it is that was going on here. He mentioned that crime rate is still increasing. Things are still going in the direction that is not projected, it's not desired, et cetera. And I'd have to wonder, well, what is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The only way we're going to be able to get a different result is by actually, like some of the other people have said here, cracking the door open, making a pathway for these folks to be able to come into compliance and being able to weed out the folks that absolutely have no desire to do that, who do want to be black market players, and get rid of those so that there can be safe access for all patients in the city of Sonoma. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jack Wagner, 270 West Napa Street, Sonoma. Thank you for having this meeting, Madam Mayor. Thanks for staff and everyone for their presentations. I was going to look up the numbers for who voted for it in Sonoma, so I appreciate that, but 62% I would not consider just a snapshot. That sounds a lot like a mandate to me. If anyone got into elected office with 62%, they would be declaring themselves king or something of Sonoma. The cash, I could totally see. I think the Class 1 issue is a very relevant issue. I would encourage you to consider drafting a resolution to our representatives in Congress, because Congress can change that. The Controlled Substance Act of 82 or 83 gives the DEA, the FDA, and Congress the ability to reschedule substances under that. So unscheduling it or taking it to 4 or 5 would basically free up a lot of these issues. To reiterate a lot of what other speakers said, the black market will only stay prevalent as long as the free market prohibits this industry. So, and there are going to be people that don't want to play by the rules, and again, that would make it a lot easier to identify those people and to give that issues to. I do represent the Green Party. I'm elected to their county council, and they are 100% in support of the legal cannabis industry. At minimum, a dispensary for the patients, I think, would be the most compassionate thing to do. I have no problem with adult recreational use or any of that industry coming in as far as the community wants it. And I think that there's a lot we can do. There was something else I had too, but I'll let that go. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sarah Schrader. I'm a fibromyalgia patient. I'm a mother of 2, and I've been active with the Sonoma chapter of Americans for Safe Access, which is a patient advocacy organization, for over 12 years. I'm also appointed to the San Francisco State Cannabis Legalization Task Force on the public policy seat, and more recently the Sonoma County Cannabis Advisory Group. With 56% of the state supporting medical cannabis back in 1996 and 59% of the state supporting recreational access now, I'm here tonight on behalf of the patients that have been waiting 17 years for their medical access to be seen locally. As you guys probably know, here in Sonoma, you guys were one of the first to create a memorandum of understanding. Before we saw ordinances and rules and regulations, Sonoma City was one of the first to say, let's create the rules that could make something work here between dispensaries and the city. And unfortunately, that dispensary came so close to a vote that it was tied, and that didn't happen. But I have to say that with you guys pushing the future forward, now you guys are behind the times. We're almost 20 years into our medical laws, and for patients to still have to drive over an hour to get their medicine or take a bus over 3 hours when they are experiencing nausea or cancer doesn't seem fair. I lived in Glen Ellen for over a year, and my children were 2 and 5 at the time. That meant that I not only had to find childcare, but I had to drive over an hour just to get what made me feel better for my quality of life. I didn't have to do that to go pick up any of my 30 medications from a pharmacy. I can't imagine patients who are on public transportation and having to go much further to get the medicine they need. I also want to address the odor. I live next door to a winery. There's sulfates that are smells that make me sick regularly. Sonoma Aroma is known that our dairy and our fertilizers are not good smells. I used to be vegetarian and vegan, and I still didn't have any right to tell my neighbor not to barbecue meat. So I don't think smells alone are what we can stop this on. As far as minors, I went to school across the street from a liquor store and adult shop, Good Vibrations. And there was only one checkpoint for a minor, which is when they get to the counter to make a purchase. For a dispensary, you have a security person, you have a membership person, and you also have a counter where you make a purchase. That's 3 checkpoints. We're not going to accidentally have minors wandering in there or have unintended use. I love the idea of having the medical facility run our dispensary, but with the CONAT decision federally, I don't think that's a possibility. I want to urge you to allow medical cannabis for not only dispensaries, but also for the cultivation. It's really hard for me as an educator when each area has a different law related to cultivation as opposed to one blanket policy in the county. So having 100 square feet with unlimited numbers, just like Sonoma County, would be my recommendation. I also want to urge you to look at the American Herbal Product Association. They do a lot of regulatory stuff related to plants, and they've created a monograph and best practices for cannabis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Julia Matheson, Jewel, most people call me. I live in 1396 Lubeck Street. I understand that several of our council members had visited a dispensary in Vallejo. I'm one of the founding members of Sonoma Patient Group, with the oldest dispensary in the county. I'd like to invite you to come and visit us in Santa Rosa. One of our council members not council members, one of our supervisors calls us the gold standard for dispensary operations. It can be done well, and it can be done really in a good way. So come and visit us. I also am not going to, there's so many points to discuss. I'm not going to even address the medical benefits. To me, that's just so clear. I do, however, want to invite you to an educational forum, How Cannabis Treats Disease, at Sonoma Vintage House, and in October I'll have flyers. I would like to submit them to the city clerk. I also would like to submit some other information. But what I want to bullet point tonight is the war on drugs. And I want to look at the agencies that profit from the war on drugs. That would be law enforcement, would be number one. I would like us to look at the tandem law enforcement, cartel, and banking industries stranglehold on prohibition and moving forward as communities. I want to ask our police to enforce criminals. I would like them to focus on criminals, not gardeners, to police our streets, not patients, to address the alcohol and opioid addiction crisis we have in our valley, and not drain our precious resources on plant eradication. And I would like to submit 2 articles to the council: Washington Post, The Drug War's Profit Motive, and Who Benefits from the War on Drugs, from the Future of Freedom Foundation. At its heart, the war on drugs is a social justice issue. The war on drugs is a war on people. It is, from its inception, it has been war on blacks and Latinos and the poor, and it persists today. It shatters lives, it breaks up families, and it destroys communities of color. Looking at our world, Charlottesville, DACA, I ask myself, when will this bigotry, this racism, this assault on God's children of color going to stop? It's immoral, it's reprehensible. This war on this plant is an assault on humanity. I'm not going to go over everything that's been spoken. I would encourage you, the smart choice would be to have a dispensary within city limits. It's the smart choice, it's the moral choice, it's a compassionate choice. And I urge that we do the right thing to support the will of patients, the people, and not the profits of the police.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Do we have anyone else who would like to comment today?
Hi, my name is Dina Welch, 1069 East Napa Street. And number one, thank you, the gentleman in the green hair. He did a great, information on everything. I wasn't sure I was going to come. I'm with Risk Sonoma as well. But I am also for the youth. And I believe, too, that marijuana is a gateway drug. And that you really need to look at that with addiction and our opioid problem and a lot of other things. I have a brother who started smoking marijuana. He is 55, and he doesn't, he has no passion for life, and it all started from marijuana. So I just want you to really look at what's happening to our youth, because they're our next generation. And the video that we're going to show at the Sebastiani really goes into the other side of cannabis and what it does to our young, kids, because we all know their brains are still forming and until they're 25. So anyways, thank you.
Thank you. Final call for public comment today. Seeing none, I will bring it back to the council. And so I believe we are giving our sort of general thoughts.
Yeah, if council at this point is interested in maybe any additional information that you may want, there's a few things we've already heard, and we'll gather and get those back to you. as we've talked about, our intention would be to bring you the moratorium to continue so that we've got time to determine what council wants to do going forward. But if you have one, request for information, two, any initial comments, but our plan would be coming back, let this absorb into you, and then come back with looking for formal direction.
So at this point, even as so far as, the sort of range of things, would it be helpful now to give an idea of where people might be?
I think if if you want to start to give us a range of things, you're welcome to look at that kind of from most restrictive to least restrictive, that policy option. You can give us some of those thoughts if you're ready. If any of you feel that you're not ready, that you want either additional information, or we also talked about a community survey. If you like additional data like that, that's another way to go. So really, as each of you are comfortable with there's a lot of information we put at you tonight. And we are not, again, not asking for a formal direction because this really was set up for as a workshop format.
All right. Anyone want to start us off? Mr. Cook?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you to staff and the consultants and for the public. I would like to have more information. I think where I'd really like to see is trying to figure out if we do have a delivery service in the city of Sonoma, how that would work as far as, one of my biggest concerns is if you have a limit, how do you get the criteria on those? So I'd like to see the criterias of even the most least restrictive. If we did allow a dispensary, how would we come across to understand who we'd pick and how that process would be? So, and then probably the thing that, and I brought it up a couple times, I'm still confused, and I'd like to get a little bit more information from the federal, state to the local level. As everybody knows in this room and probably on TV, I always talk about local control. I believe that we should have more control over our jurisdiction than the county, the state, or even the federal government, because we know our jurisdiction. So I would like a little bit more information of this whole banking, because if we do, as a council, decide to have viable businesses here in the cannabis industry, they have to be viable businesses. And I think that that's what a lot of people are concerned on the negative side of cannabis. I mean, there's other issues as far as, it being labeled a drug, and so is alcohol. So I understand that people are, worried about that. But one of my biggest concerns is that there are state taxes, there are federal taxes, and when you don't have a banking system to allow that, it causes for the black market. And those are probably the things that I would like to have a lot more information. And sorry it's so broad, but I do believe that, if we're going to move forward, either way, we should have all the facts on those.
Ms. Agramonte?
Well, I agree with David.
Your microphone, please.
Sorry, about the delivery service into the city. The other thing, and I think with our smoking ordinance, from any facility that has activities with children's activities and/or school, I thought our smoking ordinance was 1,000 feet, but I could be wrong about that.
Well, I believe that the council just ended up flat out prohibiting tobacco retailers within city limits.
Oh, okay.
Nope.
Oh, no. Yeah, we set the number at 0, but as they all leave, we're not allowing any more. We set it at 0.
Retailers were grandfathered in, but I don't believe new retailers were allowed.
That's correct.
So if you're not allowing new retailers at all, you don't need a buffer zone, and so we don't have one.
Okay. I don't know about surveys, because the people who are against cannabis could blow the survey out, or the people who are for it could blow the survey out. So I don't know how you trust a system like, I have no idea. Now that Equifax has been hacked, we can't trust anybody or anything. So I don't know how that would work, and I don't know how I don't know, what is the word I'm looking for, how qualified that would be to say, yes, 62% would like it and not. I do believe that there is a use for medical marijuana, and I think that's really important for people who don't have, I know there's Marinol that's offered to patients. I don't know how that works. I don't know that process at all. I have a lot of different concerns, of course, pesticides. Those are really a big concern to me. I can't believe I'm turning into an environmentalist. Thank you so much, Sonoma. The other thing is, you know, smoking is smoking, and I don't know about, you know, lung cancer. I have no idea where I am, what that means. It's just that I know that. And so those are just the things I'm thinking about. I am in support of continuing a moratorium, but I think that's where I am right now. Thank you.
Ms. Harrington.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone who made presentations tonight, and also to the community who's here tonight, and the number of people that have met with council members one-on-one and sent us emails. All of your comments are well taken. I thought, in brief, I would sort of tell you the things that are weighing on each side for me. So one, about 6 years ago, I had advanced cancer, and I had 27 rounds of chemotherapy, 27 days of chemotherapy. And during that time, I was a medical marijuana patient, and it was really a godsend. And it was difficult to get, and I had to go to San Francisco General Hospital to get the card, and then there was a lot of stigma about going to the dispensary. And so I have firsthand true compassion for people who really need to be able to get cannabis. And I think especially there are older people who still have a stigma attached to it, and it would really benefit them, people that are having like chemotherapy. And so from that perspective, I think it's an absolute essential that people have access to things that make them feel better in the hardest times of their life. As a parent of a teenager and soon-to-be teenager, I do think marijuana smoking by kids is a problem. I think it can really get kids off track. I think it's a big distractor, just like alcohol and opioids and other drugs are. But I think marijuana in particular, some people get into smoking pot every day and they think it's not a big deal and that it's casual, and it really can take a motivated kid and push him way off track. But I also think, on that note, that probably 100% of people that are interested in finding marijuana can currently find it, and whether we have a dispensary which will help people who are sick or not is not a determinative factor about access, because I think it's widely available. People that are interested are going to find it. So I think ultimately, and I've gone back and forth on it a lot, that the people had a vote. The vote was 62% in our town. They want it to be legal. It is not legal if it is not available. I think that is our survey. It was a presidential election. Almost everybody voted, and that's what they said. They wanted it to be legal. I feel like if we continue the moratorium for a prolonged period of time, that we are basically thwarting what the voters told us they wanted, which is they want marijuana to be legal. So I definitely support delivery. I think if it can, our town is so small, so I'm not sure there's a spot for it. I think I support a dispensary. And that's kind of where I'm at in terms of like the taxation and all that. I guess it would depend on what other people support. But I think that that certainly the voters have made it really clear that they don't want marijuana to be illegal anymore. And ultimately, over time, I even think the dispensary is a middle step to wherever marijuana is going. So it's not like we don't have an alcohol dispensary anymore. There isn't one. It's widely available. Probably that's where marijuana is going. But I don't feel comfortable telling the voters that even though they want it, I know better than they do, because we all live in this community, and I feel like that's the choice that the voters make.
Councilmember Edwards.
So in reading some of the council sits on different committees and so on, and the SBCAC is going to be hearing a cannabis cultivation and manufacturing some sort on 5.25 acres on Arnold Drive coming up, the 116 and 121 venue. both of those locations are pretty darn local as far as I'm concerned. I look at the need. I mean, I have no argument with the need from a medical perspective. My mother-in-law passed away from pancreatic cancer, and by all means, whatever she wanted to do was absolutely okay with me or with anybody else who are in those issues. I'm a little bit concerned about when I was doing a little research over the last week coming up to this about and reviewing it here. I mean, you can go get if you go to our hospital or a doctor locally, it costs you $150 or whatever it costs you. If you have insurance, somebody's paying for it. You can get a medical cannabis prescription for $49, $30, sometimes $25. You see ads all the time, so it's pretty easy to get. And in the cannabis dispensary locations that I have looked into, including the one that we went to in Vallejo, I think Madeline, the city manager, and I went in. You know, I'm not a doctor, so some of the folks that were coming in didn't really necessarily look that they were patients in pain and so on and so forth. And I have a little bit of concern over, and I'm sure people will tell me that it never happens that people go into dispensaries and then resell the product that they're picking up. I mean, the displays and everything were beautiful, but the biggest concern I had was one of the individuals that worked there said, "Oh, look at these salted caramel chocolate balls." And the person said to me, says, "Well, if he ate that entire package because they look so good and taste so good, he would be out for 4 days." And I didn't say it back to him. I just thought in my head, it's just, but if a little kid ate those, they would be dead. And so I have a lot of concern over, and I was looking through some of the things on the gummy bears and the gummy stars and the maple leaves, or they're not maple leaves, they're candy-looking leaves. I have a big concern with that. On the other side, I believe people should have access to the product. I've met with Mr. Early formally and then informally as well. We see each other on a regular basis in markets and that sort of thing. The type of products that he's producing, I think, have merit, but I'm a fan of, as very good friends of mine ran the Whole Foods business, the CEOs, and they just sold their business to Amazon. I think Amazon at some point is going to step in, or other types of delivery mechanisms are going to step in, and anybody who absolutely needs this product is going to be able to get it delivered to their door and handed to them. And I don't have a big issue with that in town, as long as it's a real operator, legal operator, that's not just a drug dealer. I mean, we don't want it to turn to that. But I'm very open to delivery in Sonoma, and I think that's the direction it will all go eventually. I don't believe the numbers at all. I think the prices are going to continue to go down. I'm in the agriculture business myself. When people see a cash crop, everybody jumps into it. And if, like in your business, David, people say it's going to be a Merlot for way back, everybody jumps into Merlot, and then all of a sudden a movie comes out and Merlot's not in favor anymore. Then it gets grafted to something else. But you have dairy farmers, and that's the business that I'm in the Central Valley, that are already talking about why should we bother with cows that it costs us $20 to make 100 pounds of milk, and we sell it for 16. They can only stay in business for so long. And we've had dairy farmers that have killed themselves because they got so far into debt. And I think the next generations are going to say, hey, this is something that we're just going to be able to rock and roll with. At our last Mayors and Councilmen's Conference in Monterey, spoke with a woman from Salinas. And if you look at what this country, we subsidize the country of Colombia hundreds of millions of dollars to not grow drugs and ship drugs to the U.S. So they're growing other agricultural crops, which are flowers and so on. We ship 747s full of that stuff every day. The flowers used to be grown in Salinas. And now what Salinas is doing is they're going to be growing cannabis in the greenhouses that are in Salinas, because which makes perfect sense to me if you lose a business. But we have a country that's subsidizing another country to compete with us on one agricultural product, and now we have to grow the drugs to make up for it. So I have a tough time with all of this. But I don't believe when people talk about all the tax money, and we've had speakers, nobody tonight really, but in the past about how many tax dollars we're going to get of this, I don't believe we're going to see much at all when it comes right down to it. So that's where I'm at. I'm open to hearing what you have to say, Mayor, but I see distribution, delivery as an interesting option down the road, and I will support a moratorium until we can get a consensus.
Well, I would like to thank you all for coming with me this far on this journey. Councilmember Harrington said it a lot more eloquently, but I do think that Prop 64 was just a sign that the world is evolving and it's just ready to, move forward with our lives and, focus on other things. So I am open to considering anything from delivery only up to one day perhaps having recreational retail. I feel like I'm probably on a limb out there. But especially looking at the composition of Sonoma, I think it's really important that we actually do have local availability for cannabis because a third of our city are seniors. All of us are only going to get steadily older, and I do think that this is just something for either health benefits or just strict quality of life, that it is something that would benefit us to have. There's a lot of little details, well, not so little, everything from, how do you manage large amounts of cash to where is it located, and all of those details I think are going to be very important in putting something together that's going to be very successful and that can be something that the city and the community embraces, and it's not something that creates a negative experience and then all of this blows up in our faces. But I am also the discussions about the concerns for the youth I hear very loud and clear, and I think that this could be really an opportunity to, just like other products when they've been prohibited and spiral out of control. I think that the combined sort of shining light and having regulation, and then pairing that with like a more dedicated and supported education program, which is something we would need anyway, because this is something that's already everywhere anyway, and I think that this is just something that we need to be a lot more put a lot more resources into educating our youth, not just about cannabis, but about a lot of the other substances that there's been a lot of abuse with lately. So I would also like to throw out that I think it's going to take a long time. If we do move in the direction of the dispensary, it will take probably a while to get it all nailed down. So I would posit coming up with a program of a temporary delivery system or program or permit or something, so that it would give us as much time as we feel like we need before we can transition it to someone, a local business, to do themselves. And then as far as between these, between delivery or even one day doing recreational retail, I think it'd be very illuminating to have some, with the county, and they did different workshops or somewhere where we can, start to drill down, like what exactly would be most helpful to people. And if it is that, delivery alone could fill our need, then, we might stop there. But I know that I've heard that there's an interest in talking about this and there's an interest in having it, but as far as the details is, I would like more opportunities to hear from the people to see what we need. And last thing, as far as the edibles, I think that this is something at the state level we're going to see lots of shifting and evolving, because I think a lot of people are really concerned about it, and I am too. And I don't know if where we can stand at a local level. I mean, I guess it could go with the types of businesses we contract and what their products are, but I do hear that concern, and I think that that is going to be something that is going to have a lot of focus in the next foreseeable future. So with that, any other comments from my co-council members? And anything else you would like from us today?
No, just thank council and the community, and I'll thank the team that put things together. Appreciate it.
All right.